Are you a rational person or are you an emotional person? Do you follow the mind or do you follow the heart? Do you believe in facts or do you believe in feelings? I think it's interesting that this alternative is almost built into the language we use, the mind or the heart, facts or feelings. You even see this in modern psychology, especially pop psychology. People, Simon Sinek's an example, will talk about whether you think with the neocortex, the rational part of the brain, or you think with the amygdala and the more animal part of the brain. Where does this, or the limbic system, I should say, where does this alternative come from? Well, it goes back at least to Plato, if not before. So Plato used this interesting analogy of the charioteer. So charioteer is this guy who's trying to control these two horses. One of the horses is the black one is base and evil. It wants to go straight to hell. It wants to follow all of its bestial instincts. The white one is the good horse that wants to go up to heaven and be moral and virtuous. The charioteer is your soul. And in this story, the charioteer is trying to wrestle control of these two horses that want to run in different directions. So the dark horse represents your emotion, your bestial animal side. The white horse represents your more rational, more virtuous side. Plato's student Aristotle, in this picture you see Plato on the left, Aristotle on the right. They differed on all sorts of things. Honestly, the differences between them are really at the root of the main alternatives in philosophy ever since. But there are a few things that they were similar on, and this is one of them. Aristotle, like Plato, saw there as being a difference between the rational side and the emotional side of the human mind. He said there is a distinction between the two parts of the soul, one which has reason in its own right, the other, which does not have it in its own right, is capable of listening to reason. So Aristotle believed we had this irrational side of or non-rational side of our soul, but it can be subjugated to the rational part of our mind. This dichotomy, this alternative between being rational and being animalistic, carries on throughout the history of philosophy, as I say, from before Plato through to the present day. The Stoics of ancient Greece, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, often misunderstood as counseling the complete suppressing of emotion. I don't think any serious Stoic has ever said that, but they did counsel the controlling, the harnessing of emotion, and certainly the reduction of painful emotions and aggressive emotions. And then you see the same alternative, like the two horses, even in Christian philosophy. You see the idea of the angel on one shoulder, the demon on the other, tempting you in different directions. Now, Christianity and religions in general don't tend to put much emphasis on reason, but the white angel, the good side, the good temptation, is still seen as the mind controlling the heart, the sensible part of yourself over the temptation of your what is seen as your base or animal instincts. And this is something that carries on right up to the present day. So this big picture here, I have a pointer, I might as well use it. This big picture here is from a 1942 Disney short called Reason and Emotion. It was made for the American government during the Second World War. And the point of that cartoon was to stress that Hitler, he manipulates people in much the way Agnieszka's described to us already, through the use of emotion, through harnessing their hatred, and also, I don't like the use of the word pride, but the cartoon uses the word pride, but what its meaning is through their desire to feel superior as well, their sense of self-worth. Hitler told the Aryan people, the German people, that they are better than everyone else, harnessed this idea that we're the strong race, we're the best race, and you see that a lot in modern systems as well. On the other hand, says this cartoon, the Americans have the opportunity to use reason to put this guy in the driving seat, not this guy. So you see this is a head, like a machine, and you can either be driven by the rational side or the emotional side. And if the guy with the club wins, then good things don't happen to you. If the guy who knows what he's doing wins, then you can win the war. And being rational, not giving into fear, not giving into emotion, was the way to win the war, according to this cartoon. Interestingly, about 70 years later, Pixar, which is owned by Disney, made this movie called Inside Out, which is quite a fun movie. It characterizes psychology in an interesting way. But the concept of Inside Out is that you have these guys who are your emotions inside your head in much the same way as this, battling for control. But there's no reason in Inside Out. There are these 5 different emotions. Joy, who's basically the only positive one, disgust, anger, sadness, and fear, all wrestling for control. And you get a sense in that movie, and I think it's reflective of the direction the culture's gone in, that the girl Riley isn't really in control of her life. It's these emotions that are pulling her one way or the other. And I think that says something about our culture. Now, as I've been discussing all of this, you can probably relate to some of it in the sense that we all feel tempted by certain desires that we know we shouldn't act on. On the benign end of the spectrum, you might be tempted by a piece of chocolate. I am a lot. You know that you've had enough sugar for today. I had that cake earlier. I had a pan au chocolat and a croissant. I probably shouldn't have dessert tonight. I probably will. It's a conference night. But you get these temptations. I stop myself at some stage, but you want to go further. You want to keep eating the sweets. That little thing, or maybe a bit more seriously, certainly something I've done in the past, you pursue a girl or a boy that you're interested in who you know isn't good for you. You know rationally it's not a good fit, but you want that person, you get infatuated, you get attached, and you keep giving into those emotions, or maybe you go through the hard work of controlling them. In a more serious sense, well, I'll give you something amusing first, which is that I have a bad tendency when I'm driving to get angry at other drivers and at just inanimate objects like traffic signals. If the light takes too long to turn green, I start shouting at it. And those kinds of temptations can be quite destructive. I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell am I doing? This is completely pointless. But it can get much more serious than that. When you're driving, if you see the light turns red in front of you, and you think, well, damn it, I don't want to stop, so you just go straight through, you could get yourself or somebody else killed doing that. If you feel something's wrong with you, you feel a pain, you feel a lump, and you're afraid to go to the doctor, you don't want to face the reality of what that might be, and you choose not to, that can have serious consequences. And it may not sound as serious, but I think it is. If you're in a bad job or a bad relationship, well, a job is a kind of relationship, really. If you're in a bad relationship with an employer or a loved one or a friend or whatever it is, and you know you should get out, but you don't want to because of fear, because of not knowing the unknown of what might happen otherwise, that can prevent you from living your life in all sorts of ways. So these things are serious, and it seems from all of these cases that Plato and Aristotle were right, that reason guy should be in control. But if you could put reason completely in control, what would that actually look like? Well, somebody tried to imagine what that might look like. That somebody was Gene Roddenberry, one of my personal heroes. And he tried to imagine what a race of beings who completely suppress their emotions down to not having any at all would look like. And he came up with the concept of the Vulcans. And this is the original Vulcan, Mr. Spock. There have been many Vulcans in Star Trek more recently. But in Star Trek, Spock completely controls his emotions, and he has no time for humans. He says, "May I say that I have not thoroughly enjoyed serving with humans. I find their illogic and foolish emotions a constant irritant." And he says things like this all the time, every week. That complains about emotional motivations and inability to understand why humans do the things they do. And I always thought to myself, as I was a child, this is interesting, but there's a bit of a problem with this concept. Where's the fun in anything? What's the point of doing anything? Why do anything? You can go through life calculating and logically reasoning about all sorts of things, but what's the point of any of it if you never get to have fun? I find it interesting that Spock, one of his catchphrases is the word fascinating. And Spock is interestingly an embodiment of curiosity as well as of logic, which seems to be a contradiction in my mind. He does have this almost emotional satisfaction in gaining knowledge and discovering things about reality. So he has a motivation for me and for himself. And that seems to suggest that even in this situation where emotion is so completely brought under control, because for those who don't know, the Vulcans of Star Trek naturally are even more emotional than humans. They had a planet-wide war, nuclear war, nearly destroyed themselves. And they realized the only way, as they saw it, to not have that happen again was to bring their emotions under control. But clearly, it seems they do still have a little bit of emotion in there, giving them some purpose, something to strive for. Nevertheless, they're almost completely emotionless. And this appealed to me as a child. And you might wonder, well, why did that appeal to you, this sort of joyless existence? So I'll give you a really simple reason why this appealed to me. And it's because I was not a normal child by any stretch of the imagination. This is me when I was 13 and 14, respectively. And my main two interests, as these pictures illustrate, were space, anything to do with astronomy, space flight, starships, and trains. I absolutely love railways. I love transport in general. I love anything that human beings build, especially if it moves. cars, planes, whatever, just anything, boats. And these were the things that gave me passion as a child. I was not a normal kid. I had these very scientific, very esoteric interests. Other kids did not. So even I went to a fairly nice school. It's called a grammar school in England. It was intended for people who are a bit different. Nevertheless, even in that context, I was an outcast, essentially. I wasn't quite weird enough to get in with the weird kids, but I was certainly weird enough to not get in with anyone else. And I was teased a lot, teased by kids who thought it was exceptionally fun to go around and find people to pick on. So I hated this emotional thing I was being subjected to by my fellow children. And I wanted to retreat into a world where people cared more about science, more about philosophy, more about these questions I was dealing with about the history of the universe and that kind of stuff. So I wanted to retreat into something more like that Vulcan culture I saw in Star Trek, a world where people are rational. And it's ironic, I think, that I didn't realize this at the time, but I was drawn to reason, to a culture of reason, a Vulcan society, by an emotion, by a feeling of rejection and of loneliness and of frustration with the very emotionalistic, very short attention span culture that I lived in, a culture that placed far more emphasis on group approval, far more emphasis on sharing little interests with each other, things like sports, things like, I don't want to pick on sports. Sports is a great thing to be interested in if you're seriously interested in it, but I think a lot of people are interested in it because their friends are interested in it. And the same thing goes for certain TV shows, certain music. It's not about a real curiosity about the subject. I very much admire people who are deeply interested in athleticism and in sports history and that kind of stuff, but it's just going along with the crowd. And I hated this emotional culture that I was rejected by. I wanted to go towards something more rational. And that led me into a study of philosophy, and I took a lot of interest in people like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. And that led me, about 15 years later, to discover Ayn Rand. And one day I just saw this video. It came up on YouTube as a suggestion. It's Ayn Rand's interview with Mike Wallace. I don't know, some of you will have seen it. It's a black and white interview, 1957, very much of its time. The two of them are sitting there in the television studio, both smoking their cigarettes. Very American scene. And one of the first things she says, he asked her to explain her philosophy. He calls it Randism, which immediately triggers her. But as soon as she's dealt with that, he asked her to just explain it in simple terms. And she says, "My philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that men need a rational morality." I thought, wow, this is perfect. This is what I've been looking for all my life. This is that Vulcan approach to life. And not only that, it integrated so much else of what I already believed. I knew since I was a kid that government shouldn't be running my education. I felt that the popular philosophy of the day was being forced on me. I knew from my interest in trains that privatization made the railways better in certain ways. So whenever she talked about how roads should be built and how schools should be run, it resonated with me. So I was very taken by Rand's approach to reason. And interestingly, it wasn't an emotionalist approach to reason. Rand presented a version that integrates the two, integrates reason and emotion. I'll talk more later about how it does that. But it was a passionate rationality. It was a rational lifestyle that doesn't suck the fun out of life. So before I go and talk about the integration of reason and emotion, I want to get clear on what these terms mean and try and carry on in the spirit of everyone else who's spoken today, because the other speakers today have done a wonderful job of clarifying their terms. So I'm going to try and do the same thing. So we have that picture of Plato and Aristotle again at the start. And Plato saw reason as the part of the soul that rules over the other parts, which he called our spiritedness and our passions. So Plato saw the soul as being divided. That's not terribly important. The important thing is that he saw reason as that controlling aspect that rules over the other parts. Aristotle went a bit further. He thought that reason was the thing that distinguishes human beings from all the other animals. He called human beings the rational animal. Some of you might know that from Rand's writing, but she gets it from him. And he thought that reason was the part of us that tells us about the world and how to live. So he saw it not just as guiding our actions, but telling us the nature of reality and accordingly how we should act in it. Both how we should work out what the good is, what good life means, and ultimately achieve it. So that was the ancient Greek perspective, at least from the prominent Greek philosophers. But as you all know, there was a bit of a dark age after that for a while in Europe. Things were a bit better in other parts of the world, but Europe went a bit philosophically dead for about 800 years. And then it comes back in the Enlightenment, and you get a very different perspective of reason emerging in the European Enlightenment, starting with René Descartes, whose meditations, I think, should be renamed An Exercise in Spurious Reasoning, but that's only for anyone who's read it. But he rejects the senses altogether. He doesn't think that reason should have anything to do with the outside world. He wants reason to be just in your mind, that you should be able to think based purely on thoughts that you already have, things that you can know by yourself just thinking without any reference to what's outside. That gives you Descartes' famous line, I think, therefore I am, or I am the thinking animal, or thinking being. So Descartes wanted to completely uncouple reason from the outside world, start from the knowledge that I exist because I'm clearly here thinking about this stuff, and just reason back from there. And he, impressively, through all sorts of interesting attempts at reasoning, works his way back to a basically Catholic perspective of the world. But that's a matter for another discussion. But he sets the stage in all sorts of ways for the people who followed, for Immanuel Kant and for David Hume, among others. Agnieszka talked about Hegel. All of these people are in the tradition of Descartes, ultimately. Kant, who's down here, he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, which is basically attacking a thing I wouldn't recognize as reason, but he calls it pure reason. Sorry, I missed out. I jumped over Hobbes, who Agnieszka talked about, who saw reason as just addition as subtraction, basically, but applied to other areas of life besides mathematics. And then Kant saw reason as separate from understanding. He thought it's just judgments drawn from other judgments. So the same as Descartes, essentially. Reason is just things you derive from other thoughts you already have. And then Hume, this jolly British chap over here, I'm afraid I'm not terribly proud of him as a fellow Brit, he said, reason is wholly inactive and can never be the source of so active a principle as conscience or a sense of morals. So you see here a complete rejection of Aristotle's perspective. Reason is not our way of working out how to live our lives. It is completely unrelated to moral matters. Morality comes from some other place. Kant, as some of you may know, thought that morality comes from categorical imperatives, these just laws that we are essentially innate within us, that we have knowledge of by other means. And Hume also said, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Your reason, in Hume's view, should take a back seat. If you think back to the slide with the two men in the head, reason should sit at the back and let the passions drive you around. And you see this perspective, this post-Descartes, Cartesian perspective, if you like, played out in more recent writings. I referenced Simon Sinek earlier, and his book, Start With Why, is actually a very good book on marketing, if you're interested in building a business. I've got a gentleman shaking his head who doesn't agree, so that's potentially, if you're a marketer, you might not. I certainly found it interesting in looking at businesses, but it's really bad morally. And one of the main reasons is that Sinek sees reason as, much like Hobbes does, as just being a matter of calculation, of purely data-driven thinking, of logical reasoning, constrained to money and those sorts of calculations. He doesn't see any connection between reason and values. And so Sinek sees there as being, he thinks most people are driven by the animal brain, by our gut desires. We follow our guts, and reason essentially takes a backseat. He doesn't see any role for reason in making decisions about our values or about morality. So to my mind, this perspective isn't livable. I don't think you can uncouple reason from reality. I think that undermines what reason essentially is. And so for a rational definition of reason, unsurprisingly, I'm going to go to Ayn Rand. And she offers a definition that puts the reality back in reason. She says, reason is the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. So what Rand is saying here, I'm just going to take a water for a second, sorry. I had to use the Star Trek water bottle, so sorry for the extra second it took me to unlid it. So what Rand is doing here is she's rejecting the post-Descartes, post-Kant mindset of philosophers that separates philosophy from reality. And I think that's the origin of the modern perspective of philosophy. A lot of people think philosophy is just academics in ivory towers discussing their views on the nature of reality and the absolute and all this other stuff. And it doesn't really matter day to day. Does it matter whether there's an analytic synthetic dichotomy if I just want to figure out if I should take this job or not? And Rand brings it right back to that. She said, reason is your ability to pull together a consistent view of the world based on your sensory experience, based on the things that happen around you. And that means that reason can apply to all sorts of areas of life, not just to calculations about mathematics and that kind of stuff, but about ethics and about morality and politics. And so Rand very much is trying to get away from that perspective and make reason something that all of us need to use every day in every aspect of our lives. So that's the definition of reason I'm using. Reason is your ability to integrate the things you see in the world around you into a consistent worldview. On the other hand, emotion. There's a lot of different perspectives on emotion as well. Essentially, we will think of emotions as good or bad feelings. And a lot of people think of them as things that just kind of happen to you. They see them as primaries. You'll hear people say this sort of stuff. You'll get into an argument with somebody and they'll tell you later, I was just in a bad mood. I was just angry. I don't really know why, it just kind of happened. There's this lack of control, this idea that a feeling just occurs, it's some kind of base primary. And I think some of this goes back to philosophers who, in the Kantian Humean period, who saw them as innate ideas or thought that emotions told you something about another world. Also in religion, you get the idea a lot that through feeling and thinking, you can access other dimensions that tell you truths about the world. Most explicitly in Nietzsche, where your will is basically the standard of ethics, particularly the will of certain people. And so you're basically, your thinking is uncontrollable in that perspective. A lot of people don't explicitly hold that view, but it is implicit in the way they talk about emotions. They just kind of happen to you. They're not something you can control. Rand, on the other hand, saw emotions as a state in response to a stimulus. They're not just feelings that come from anywhere, they're always in response to something. And Leonard Peikoff explains that process in this four-stage process. He says that there are four essential stages to experiencing an emotion. You perceive or imagine something, that's the first stage. So either something happens to you, like maybe your friend tells you he doesn't like you anymore, just really basic example, or you imagine something like that happening. That's a negative example, it might be positive, you imagine winning the lottery, or maybe you do suddenly get a massive pay rise at work or something. There's some kind of prompt, some kind of initial thing that happens. That's the first thing, the perception or imagination. The second is identification. This process, by the way, is happening instantly, almost in your mind. This is all going on subconsciously. You perceive something or imagine something, you identify it, your brain recognizes that this is a certain type of entity. When something happens in front of you, if you've been involved in some kind of incident or you see something, you suddenly break a glass, whatever, initially you just perceive the thing, you just hear the smash, see the event, and then you identify what it is. And sometimes there's a perceptible delay and sometimes it's basically instant. The third is evaluation. So that you've seen the thing, you've identified what it is, and then you make some kind of evaluation. It's either good for me or bad for me. Again, subconsciously. And then you respond. And that fourth stage is the feeling you experience and the actions you take in response to that feeling. And this process is so fast that you can't, most of the time, stop it, at least in the first three stages, in the moment. Certain things happen to you. If your psychology is a certain way, you're just going to react a certain way. So, and it doesn't matter how rational you are, whatever your framework is, if certain things happen to you, you're going to react a certain way. So if I see somebody get injured, I'm going to feel sad. I'm going to have that. We're all going to have these sorts of reactions. If somebody comes up and slaps you in the face, you're probably going to get angry. However rationally controlled you are. Whether you act on it or not is another matter, but these feelings are so fast. And that, I think, is why people have this idea that you can't control them. It's because they happen so quickly that in the moment, you often can't. You can take control of your actions if you train yourself to. So yeah, a guy can come up or if you're Will Smith sitting there and somebody insults your wife, you can decide not to go up there and smack him. You're going to sit there and want to. If your values, what you perceive as good or bad for you has been negatively affected or positively affected, you're going to have that emotional reaction. So people think of it as being this uncontrollable thing, but really it's only uncontrollable in the short term, and I'll expand on that more. And it's rather like the physical reactions we have to things like flames and heat. We're going to pull our leg away from a hot thing or something like that, although we could decide consciously to go back if we wanted to. And it's important, that analogy is important because our emotions are a reaction to stimulus in the same way that our physical reactions are. They are there to tell us when something is good or bad for us. They are not just random feelings that come along. They are a natural process of figuring out whether or not the thing that we're responding to, the event or the imagined event, is actually good or bad for our lives, much the same way as a physical reaction. But in both cases, they can be wrong. They're essential to human life. You need to be able to get out of scary situations quickly. You need to know when a person is good for you or bad for you to hang around, but they're not reliable. They're not a guide to action. They are a piece of information that comes into your calculation. So I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit more. Ayn Rand says that reason and emotion are different, I'm not quoting her, I'm just paraphrasing. They're different faculties with different functions. So I'll quote from her directly. She says, an emotion as such tells you nothing about reality, beyond the fact that something makes you feel something. So if you feel angry at somebody, all you know in that moment is that that person or whatever that person did made you feel angry. You don't know that that's a bad person, that what they did is bad. You don't know anything else. It's not a piece of confirmed information about reality. All you know is you had this feeling in response to something. You then, according to Rand's perspective, have to rationally analyze that situation to determine if your feeling was actually accurate. And your feeling is a piece of information. Because it's important to recognize that your emotions aren't just coming out of nowhere. They're coming out of your past experiences and things you've integrated before. Good example of this is if you wave a gun in the face of somebody like a child or somebody from a culture that's never seen a gun before, they're not going to be afraid of it. They have no idea what it is. It's just a black stick. It doesn't mean anything. You're only going to have a fear reaction to that if you know what guns are and what they do. And you can see the same thing would be true of cars, all sorts of things that exist that we would all run away from in a flash, that we wouldn't even think before hiding if somebody brought a gun out in front of us. But somebody who doesn't know what a gun is isn't going to have that reaction to it. So your emotional reactions are based on your past integrated experiences. So there are situations in which you will feel a fear reaction, and you have this with people. You will be with somebody and you'll just feel, this guy's wrong. There's something off with this guy. And you can't place what it is. And so according to Rand's perspective, what you need to do there is go away, probably take a pause, like don't immediately go into a relationship with this person or something. Go away, think rationally, work out where that feeling has come from. What past experience, what evidence is making me feel this way? And then, so your emotion is a piece of information, it's a vital piece of information, but it's not a guide to action, it's not a piece of firm evidence about reality, it's just a pointer. And it can be wrong, and you need to be able to use reason in order to know when it's wrong. I quite like the line from the Reason and Emotion cartoon, which this is taken from, where at the end it says, fix reason firmly in the driving seat, emotion by his side. It's not emotion, it's not reason in place of emotion, it's reason and emotion working side by side, but reason's in the front seat. And that's a really good way of seeing it in Rand's perspective. And just to drive home the point that these are two different faculties with two different functions, Rand makes the point that you can't know truth by feeling in the same way that you can't enjoy pleasure logically. You can't reason your way to having fun. They are completely different things with completely different functions. So your emotions are your way of knowing whether or not something's good or bad for you, and also enjoying the good things. It's your reward for success, for living fully. So when you lose values, when you struggle in life, your negative emotions tell you not to keep going that way. When you succeed, when you flourish, they reinforce the right direction. They give you pleasure. They are a major part of the reward of successfully living. And that's why Rand thought that happiness was the proper moral goal of a person's life. And I mentioned Star Trek earlier and the character of Spock. I wanted to make an important point about Star Trek. I'll just point the Star Trek logo that way, so just for the hell of it. Which is that the original series of Star Trek was not trying to say Spock is the way we should live. Spock was one part of a three-part commanding team on the original Enterprise. They all represented different aspects of human psychology. Spock is reason without emotion. McCoy is supposed to be the opposite of that. He is the emotional one. He always has the aggressive, angry reaction to everything. He shouts all the time. He has sort of, again, he's an intelligent man. He's certainly a scientist, but he has that very quick, very emotional response to everything. Kirk, the captain, is the balance of the two. He's the integration of reason and emotion. Kirk will, when it's appropriate, get really angry or get very amorous on frequent occasions, or just get happy, whatever it is. But his emotions are aligned with his values. He knows what he stands for. He's very principled. He's rationally thought about what he stands for. And his emotions are in support of his rational values. So when he sees injustice, he gets mad. But when the situation calls for calm and calculation, he brings that to the table. So Star Trek, I misunderstood a bit as a younger person. I thought that Spock was the ideal, but it's really Kirk, the balance, the integration of the two, that's the ideal. So going to how you can achieve that ideal in terms of the objectivist view, which I think, in terms of talking about Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry and Ayn Rand were both fans of each other. They had very similar perspectives on this and a lot of other issues. I can talk about that more if people want to drill into that. But from Rand's perspective, it's important to understand that Rand was very into the idea that human beings have free will. And that's often misunderstood. Free will does not mean you have the ability to just, I like to say, jump states. It doesn't mean you can instantly go from one state to another. It doesn't mean you can just magic things into being. What free will means is you have the ability to activate your mind. You can choose to activate your mind and start thinking. And that starts a process that takes time and takes effort to complete. So when you get that sudden emotion, when the guy comes up and slaps you in the face or insults your wife or whatever happens, or maybe somebody says, "You're a wonderful guy, I think you're amazing," and you just go, like whenever those emotions come, you're not going to be able to stop that emotion in that moment. But what you can do, if that emotion is irrational, if seeing somebody who's speaking a different language or looks different to you in the street makes you angry, and you identify that that emotion is irrational, or maybe seeing a person who you know is not a good fit for you makes you amorous and affectionate, and you know that's not a good thing, or maybe just chocolate makes you want more of it, whatever it is, you have the choice there to say, okay, I know this isn't rational, I'm going to turn my brain on and I'm going to work on changing that. And you can rationally work on changing your values, bringing them into line with your reason, and it takes a long time, longer depending on how strong the emotion is. The important thing in objectivism is not that you are completely successfully where you need to be right now, it's that you're actively working on improving from where you are to where you want to be. So please do not go out there if you're an objectivist and get sort of angry at everybody who's not completely rational yet. If they're working on it, that's where you want them to be. As long as they are working on it, as long as they have their minds engaged, as long as they are thinking rationally, as clearly all of you are from the fact you are here today. So basically, I've created this little flow chart to explain the process as I see it. So you get an emotion, and that just it seems to just happen. It comes from somewhere. And then you go through a rational evaluation. You stop and think, why did I feel that emotion? What is that emotion telling me? Is this thing actually good or bad for my life? And then over time, you build up a code of rational values. Some of them will be consistent with the emotions you felt. If you see somebody being hurt, you get angry, you realize, well, that's bad for human life. That person has rights, they're being violated, whatever it is. And you keep that emotion the way it was. Another thing, you realize that I'm irrationally attracted to this person, or whatever the particular situation is. I irrationally get angry at this thing that's perfectly fine. You train yourself out of that, you realign your values, and you get yourself to a point where you're going to have a different reaction. But that takes a lot of time and a lot of thinking. But once you get there, once you have your rational values and you habituate them, then you will start to feel emotions that are more positive. I've been through this process. It takes years. I am not claiming to have completed it. I still get emotions that I know aren't rational, but I'm a hell of a lot closer than I used to be 10 years ago. The interesting thing is I've always had the sense, if just looking at it in terms of romantic relationships, I've always only been attracted to people who are intelligent. That's always been something I've needed in a partner. But for a long time, I was not attracted to people who shared my values on a deeper level. I was attracted to all sorts of random people for all sorts of random reasons. And it took me a long time to discover and unpick and untangle those reasons and get that emotion uncoupled. And now I don't experience that anymore. I will only connect with a person. I'm not just talking about romantic and physical attraction. I will only connect with a person as a friend or as an intimate partner if that person is deeply, fundamentally aligned with my values. Again, doesn't mean they need to be at my level or a higher level of development on this. It just means that those fundamental values are the same. I'm working on it with diet. That's a longer process of trying to train myself to eat less sweets. But if food isn't high protein, I don't want it anymore. And that was never the case before. So for the most part anyway. So it can be done. And And there's a useful analogy from the computing world, which Ayn Rand references and I find very helpful, which is the concept of garbage in, garbage out, or GIGO. If you put bad programming in, you're going to get bad results out. The same thing applies to your premises, to the ideas you hold. If you have bad premises, bad fundamental ideas, then you're going to get bad emotions. If you have good premises, good fundamental ideas, you're going to get good emotions. Your values precede your emotions. Your emotions are reactions to your values. So the essential message here is subordinate your emotions to your reason. Use your reason to work out what's true. Like Agnieszka said, truth exists. Your way of discovering it is your rational faculty. But don't suppress your emotions. Don't abandon your emotions. Get your emotions in line with your reason. Use your reason to choose the right values. Don't just accept values from the culture or from your own feelings. So it's very easy to have these reactions that you pick up and you don't know where you pick them up from. You might have picked them up from family, from TV shows, from some aspect of the culture around you. But don't accept that. Think carefully about your values and change them, and your emotions will follow in time. And like I said, emotions cannot be changed. They can be changed gradually. You can cool yourself down, but that initial spike is still going to happen. Don't be put off by the fact that 6 months after trying to change a feeling, you still get the feeling. That's going to happen with stronger feelings. Give it time and keep working on it, and you will get there in the end. Wrong button. So if you want to know more about this, I am writing a book at the moment about how to apply, well, I've written it now, I'm being heavily edited by my friend Tim, and I'm currently editing my book about reason and how to apply it to your life. It's called Reason for Living, and it's applying Ayn Rand's ideas and various other ideas to the self-development world. I'm trying to present it in a bit more of a sort of accessible, normal way, not so high and philosophical, but more mundane and accessible for you regular Joe. And so if you're interested in this, sign up, and you can also head over to, I'm on Instagram at RFL_reason for living, or you can find out more about the book at that address. I'll leave that up for a moment if you want to take pictures or anything. Okay, that's the end of the moment. And then I'll go over to questions if anyone wants to ask anything.